Representative Egbert of Boise sits on the Commerce and Human Resources Committee, the Environment, Energy, and Technology Committee, and the Health and Welfare Committee. She joins us in the studio to discuss proposed budget cuts and her legislative priorities for the rest of the legislative session. Representative Egbert, thank you so much for joining us here today. The first question that we wanted to ask you is, what has the atmosphere been like in the legislature this week? What are some of the major bills that are being worked on, and what's the general environment been like?
Yeah, so I think right now everything just feels a little bit rushed because tomorrow is supposed to be the deadline to have a bill introduced in committee, except for there's a few committees that you can continue to have them introduced in. But for most of our committees, tomorrow is supposed to be the deadline. So you will see, tomorrow probably a lot of RSs. And so people are really busy trying to get their stuff added to agendas.
And with that, the governor this week signed into law the new tax conformity bill, which will add tax cuts from the Big Beautiful Bill and cost the state of Idaho around $155 million. Can you tell us what your priorities are with a tight budget and an even tighter proposed cuts from JFAC this last week? Can you tell us what your budget priorities are and what you'll be advocating for in the budget negotiations?
Yeah, well, my priorities always seem to revolve around affordable health care for Idahoans, and especially at a time like this when we've seen significant increases in premiums for private insurance. Some state employees even saw up to a 17% increase in their premiums. So for me, a lot of my priorities have to do with Medicaid, and specifically Medicaid expansion, which we know to repeal would cost the state over $20 million in deferred costs. So I talk a lot about Medicaid expansion. I've had a lot of opportunities to do so this session because it looks like an easy target when you are trying to balance a budget. But in my opinion, and I think most Idahoans' opinions, it's a terrible decision to try and touch that because we're just going to pay for it somewhere else, somewhere where we don't get as many federal dollars for it.
And I know that you mentioned that this is the last week to introduce any bills, and you mentioned your priorities with the budget. Are there any bills that you have introduced or are planning to introduce with the deadline coming up?
Yes, I am hoping that I will have one on the agenda tomorrow that has to do with rental application fees. I had the privilege of serving on the interim land use and housing committee, which really looked at affordability across the state and what is impacting that for Idahoans. We know from some recent surveys that the cost of housing and finding housing is such a huge issue for Idahoans. So I've reworked a bill from last year. Senator Robbie had a bill, and I have reworked it to hopefully be introduced this year again, but it would essentially just say that if you're going to charge application fees for a rental unit, then you need to actually have a unit available and you actually need to do what you say you're going to do with the fees. Because what we're hearing is that without the ability to regulate these anymore, some bad actors could be charging, an entire list of applicants fees, even if they have no intention of renting to them.
And with the proposed bill, so if I'm remembering right, you represent a district inside of Boise. Is that correct?
Yes, correct.
So with the proposed bill to incur fines on cities that fly flags that aren't officially recognized by the state, what's your comment on that bill, your perspective on that bill, and how do you intend on voting on that?
Yeah, I intend on voting no on the bill. I think it, it unfairly targets one city who, used their own lawful process to decide what flags they wanted to fly. But at the same time, although, yes, I'm voting no, I'm really sick of talking about flags. I don't think that's what resonates with most Idahoans right now. I don't think we need to keep bringing this pointless legislation just to try and punish my city. I think we need to really look at things like affordability, housing, access to health care that actually impact most Idahoans.
And thank you so much again for joining us. We really appreciate it. I've just got one more question for you. What would you say is the best way for your constituents to be involved in the legislative process?
Yeah, that's a great question. Not to sound too self-promotional, but I do a midweek update video on my Instagram every single week that just kind of highlights what I think are like the three most important things that are happening that week. So that's Megan for Idaho on Instagram. And then I encourage like one action item on there as well. So hopefully my constituents can tune in and learn a little bit more about the process.
Great. And thank you so much again, Representative. We really appreciate it. And thanks for just hopping on and going right for it. That's super helpful to us. And we really appreciate that.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for calling.